The terror attack in Pahalgam, April 22nd, 2025, a really brutal event. Today, we're going to dive into the international reaction, or maybe the lack of it, and India's strategic options now.
Yeah, and this is especially crucial for you, the UPSC aspirant. Understanding India's place on the world stage after something like this. It's vital for mains, for prelims too. Think international relations, security, diplomacy.
Exactly. And we're drawing on analysis from the Hindu today. So we'll look at those first global responses to Pahalgam.
Mm-hmm.
Then this really troubling idea of my terrorist versus your terrorist, these inconsistencies.
Right.
We'll also touch on the apparent silence around Hinduphobia in this context. And finally, what paths can India take strategically? Okay, let's unpack this.
So right after the attack, yes, we saw some initial condemnation. That's expected. But what stood out was how quickly big players, the US, EU, Russia, came out urging restraint.
Restraint.
Yes, directed at both India and Pakistan.
Towards both sides. That feels significant, doesn't it? Like, aren't they kind of putting the victim and, the state accused of harboring the attackers on the same level?
That's really the heart of it. It blurs the moral clarity, when you're talking about terrorism. It's a definite shift if you compare it to, say, the post-9/11 era.
Yeah, that unity feels like a long time ago now. Why the change? What's driving this different approach?
Well, there are several things going on. You've got major conflicts already: Ukraine, Gaza, West Asia. They're draining diplomatic energy. Maybe there's just less appetite for getting deeply involved in another potential flashpoint in Asia.
Global bandwidth is stretched thin, makes sense.
Sure.
But is there anything specific to the India-Pakistan dynamic influencing this?
Oh, absolutely. Pakistan's nuclear weapons, they act as a major deterrent against really strong international action. It complicates things enormously.
The risk factor.
Exactly. The fear of escalation, even if it seems unlikely, often seems to, push aside the need to hold states accountable for backing terror groups.
Which kind of leads us neatly into this uncomfortable idea. My terrorist versus your terrorist. It really seems like reactions are selective now. Depends on who's involved.
It's a very accurate way to put it, unfortunately. The counterterrorism landscape, globally, it's become much more about specific interests rather than universal principles.
How did that manifest?
You see Western nations focusing heavily on, say, REMVE, that's religiously and ethnically motivated violent extremism. It's a priority for them. Meanwhile, the OIC might push back against criticism of Islamist terror by raising Islamophobia concerns.
Right.
And understanding this selectivity, this interest-based approach that's really important for your IR paper. It shows the complex, sometimes cynical side of how states interact.
And there are pretty clear examples involving India, too, aren't there?
Definitely. Look at Canada, hesitating to act firmly against anti-India groups there, often citing free expression.
Right.
Or even more clearly, China, repeatedly using its UNSC veto to shield Pakistan-backed terrorists. That's geopolitics overriding counter-terror principles, plain and simple.
It's it's a frustrating pattern. And it's not just about India, is it? You mentioned Africa before.
That's right. The Sahel region in Africa, it's seen a huge surge in terrorist activity. But the international response, pretty muted, relatively speaking.
So it feels like terrorism there is seen as someone else's problem.
Increasingly, yes. It reinforces this idea that unless it directly impacts major powers, the response might be limited, not seen as a truly global threat demanding a unified front anymore.
So with this kind of fragmented global picture, India often seems to face, double standards when it comes to terrorism from Pakistan.
Yeah, the term often used is conditional sympathy. India gets expressions of sorrow, sure, but they're almost immediately followed by these calls for restraint.
Always framed in terms of regional stability.
Exactly. The pressure implicitly falls on India, the victim, to de-escalate rather than on the state sponsor.
It's interesting when you compare it, like you mentioned, to Ukraine. There's strong Western backing for Ukraine resisting a nuclear Russia.
Right. But then a hesitancy to offer the same unequivocal support for India's right to self-defense against terror from nuclear-armed Pakistan. The contrast is quite stark, isn't it?
It really is. It makes you question, for your exams perhaps, what really guides international responses.
Precisely. What are the underlying principles versus the strategic calculations?
And then there's another layer here, the alleged targeting of Hindus in the Pahalgam attack.
Yes, and this highlights a real concern: the lack of global acknowledgement or perhaps understanding of Hinduphobia.
Compared to other forms of religious hatred.
Exactly. There's rightly strong condemnation of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Christianophobia. But when Hindus are targeted, like allegedly here, there often seems to be this silence, or it's just not framed in terms of religious hatred.
That's a significant disparity in the global conversation. You gave an example earlier.
Yes, the case of Vivek Ramaswamy, the U.S. presidential candidate, he faced criticism that seemed, clearly linked to his Hindu faith. It sort of points to how non-Abrahamic religions can be marginalized in these wider discussions.
But you did mention one voice that was quite explicit.
Correct. Tulsi Gabbard, when she was U.S. Director of National Intelligence. Her statement was notable because she directly called the Pahalgam attack a horrific Islamist terrorist attack targeting Hindus.
So she named the ideology and the victim's identity.
Yes, which stood in contrast to the more generalized statements from many others.
Okay, so navigating this complex, often frustrating landscape, what are India's strategic options? Where does it go from here?
Well, even with this sense of maybe diplomatic isolation on some fronts, India isn't without leverage. Domestically, obviously, staying vigilant, strengthening counter-terror measures, that's constant.
And internationally?
Internationally, I think India needs to really step up its campaign against all forms of religiophobia, specifically highlighting the gaps when it comes to non-Abrahamic faiths.
So more diplomatic effort on that front.
Consistent diplomatic engagement, yes. Proactively pointing out potential religious bias where it occurs.
We've also seen India trying some different geopolitical moves recently.
We have. Pausing the Indus Waters Treaty discussions, challenging Pakistan's narrative more directly at the UNSC. These suggest a more assertive posture.
And Pakistan's attempts to internationalize Kashmir haven't really worked at the UNSC lately.
No, they haven't gained traction. But India still needs sharp diplomatic skills to keep building international support, not just blocking negative moves.
Are there specific partners India should focus on?
Cultivating ties with key Gulf nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE seems crucial. They have their own concerns about extremism, and they're changing internally.
Shared interests there.
Potentially. Opportunities for cooperation on counterterrorism, intelligence sharing, joint diplomatic initiatives. Ultimately, India's multi-alignment approach, it needs to deliver concrete results in areas like this.
So wrapping this part up, Pahalgam seems to have really thrown into sharp relief the world's selective moral compass on terror, and maybe India's increasing need to rely on itself.
I think that's a fair assessment. As that old unified global stance against terror seems to fade, India needs to be ready to act more autonomously, not just militarily or strategically, but diplomatically, ideologically too.
Asserting its own path, challenging those double standards seems key.
Absolutely essential for securing its interests in this environment.
So a final thought for our listeners, especially you preparing for UPSC. Considering everything we've discussed, drawing from the Hindus analysis, what specific diplomatic tools should India prioritize now in its counterterrorism strategy going forward?
That's a really good question for you to mull over as part of your preparation.
Indeed. And we hope this deep dive has given you valuable insights for that preparation. For more discussions on critical topics relevant to your UPSC journey, please do like, subscribe, and feel free to leave your questions in the comments. We'll try to address them.